Swing low, swing for to carry me home. And fight the sky is red. My breath is gone cold, a kiss from cold blanket, snow overhead. Slow, holy it's just in the room. Hold your tears where they belong all these years down from oh, snake eyes, you were better just now. All the pigs and pray for love from the heaven above. Lay the ashes below. Lay the ashes below. Lay the ashes below. Lay the ashes below.
Welcome back to the Book of Revelation, Historicist View. We are Lebanon Springs House, and this is part 26, Dry Me a River. Before we begin our review today, I hope that you're able to take the time to read the quotes at the beginning of this video. There's just no way possible to cover all of the information that supports this view, so I'm probably going to attach similar features to these last 4 or 5 videos concluding the series. If you were unable to read them all, I hope you'll go back and stop the video long enough to do so. These are easily verified quotes, and I believe add force to the case for historicism. And now, let's review our last video where we saw the 5th bowl poured out upon the seat of the papal beast, as Victor Emmanuel II became the king of the newly unified Italy, with Rome as its capital, causing this beast to lose all its temporal power, not to mention the degradation and demotion from being Christ on earth to what amounts to the executor, legislature, and judiciary of Vatican City. The seat of the beast, having always been Rome, was truly now reduced to a mere 121-acre parcel, and as I said last time, he definitely took a back seat compared to his former glory. However, this time we're going to discover how the Euphrates River is dried up. Why? Well, to make way for those kings from the east. And really ask the question that begs to be asked, is that really China marching with a 200 million man army, as many people speculate today? I mean, if we just remember what we've been through so far, our study revealed that the 200 million man army actually formed the 6th trumpet judgment of the Ottoman Turks. who indeed did come from the east, and they took down Constantinople in 1453 AD. So, if we've been right so far, this can't be China again marching across the Euphrates River to make war on the West, even though they may boast of that many soldiers. And I think by the end of today's video, you're probably going to agree with me. So all we have to do, all that's left to do, is to ask, how is it that the Euphrates River is dried up? And of course, who are these kings from the east? Remember, I told you last time, you are going to have to forget everything that you've ever heard about this portion of the prophecy and keep an open mind. And even though I'm going to present two possibilities today, I'll tell you which one is my favorite, of course, as well as strengthen my case that we are on the verge of Messiah's return. And with that, let's get started. And as usual, we're going to begin with the symbolism of our only verse today, verse 12, which reads, "And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." Now, this is the second time that we have seen the great river Euphrates in the book of Revelation. And even without the symbolism, we should expect there to be some kind of connection with that first appearance. And Adam Clarke will begin our commentary on the symbolism today, as he tells us, probably meaning the people in the vicinity of this river. Next, Albert Barnes reminds us of that first encounter with this great river, where those four angels were loosed, and it's fitting to go back and look at that since we do expect some sort of connection. This river was on the east of Palestine, and the language used here naturally denotes that the power referred to under the sixth trumpet would spring up in the east. He says the fair interpretation is that there were forces in the vicinity of the Euphrates which were, up to this period, bound or restrained, but which were now suffered to spread woe and sorrow over a considerable portion of the world. And again, remember, he's talking about the sixth trumpet, so we can get a good idea of that Euphrates River power that is in play here. But our next symbol to tackle is that of the waters being dried up. And again, I defer to Revelation itself, chapter 17, verse 15, to define that symbol. Yeshua said unto John, "The waters which you saw where the horse sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." Really, our minds should already be envisioning some people group, most likely that of the sixth trumpet, to become, shall we say, overcome. And the drying up of the waters, which prepares a way, let's look at that word way in the Greek. It is hodos, primarily a road, and by implication, progress. It can be translated as mode, means, journey, or highway. And the fact that it's making this way for the kings from the east or of the east, well, be sure to know that we're going to be revisiting this expression several times today. But let's just begin with the fact that the words translated as from the east or of the east, they're actually just two Greek words, and it would be helpful to look at those. The first one is Anatole, meaning rising, and Helios, sun. And so this is translated here as from the east or of the east. And this is the point where later on I'm going to actually offer two possible outcomes for this portion of the symbol. But suffice it to say that we find ourselves asking once again, does the Euphrates River really need to be dried up so China can cross in the 21st century? Or is that interpretation all wet? Well, quickly arriving at the interpretation portion of today's video, let's begin by looking at the dates that possibly frame this event historically, 1876 to 1917. And I remind you, the fifth bowl judgment concluded in 1870 when nationalism overtook Italy, essentially ending the papal beast's temporal rule. And we begin with the symbolism of the Euphrates River drying up. Now remember that the first time we saw the Euphrates River in the book of Revelation was during the sixth trumpet judgment. And this map that we see clearly shows the Euphrates River in blue, and we'll remember the four angels that were held in bound, or in check, if you will, at that river, representing the four Turkish states that had been, again, forbidden to cross until such a time as that fourth Turkish state was let loose and crossed the Euphrates River in 1081, heading directly for Constantinople. And it was from within this fourth Turkish state, the Seljuk Turks, that the Ottoman dynasty arose. And in 1453, we remember that they took the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, ending the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, this series of maps shows the progression of the Ottoman Empire just shortly after the taking of Constantinople, right up until what will prove to be the Sixth Bowl Judgment. Let's make sure we understand this important connection. That sixth trumpet, i.e. the Ottoman dynasty, continued to expand its vast empire right up until the Sixth Bowl Judgment. And we could rightly ask if this Euphrates power is one and the same. And so looking at the Ottoman Empire as of 1914 AD, which is really just a mere 3 years before the fulfillment of the Sixth Bowl Judgment, we can see that the extent of that kingdom, how large it got, and even though it's difficult to see on this map, it encompassed all of what we know today as Israel, including large portions of Saudi Arabia and all of Turkey. And with that as our backdrop, we look to Mr. Barnes to begin the interpretation of this symbol. On the situation of that river, Mr. Barnes says the reference there was supposed to be to the Turkish power. And the analogy of interpretation would seem to require that it should be so understood here. There is every reason, therefore, to suppose that this passage has reference to something in the future history of the Turkish dominions, and to some bearing of the events which are to occur in that history on the ultimate downfall of the anti-Christian power referred to by the beast. Now let me take just a second to point out that the historicist view dates this sixth bowl to have begun in 1876. Mr. Barnes, however, did not live past 1870, hence his remark that refers to something in the future history of the Turkish dominions. While Mr. Barnes was still alive, the Ottoman Empire stood firm. And next we're going to see that John Gill concurs with Mr. Barnes. So may the Turks who inhabit by this river be intended by it, and the rather, as this sense exactly corresponds with the sixth trumpet. For as the sounding of that trumpet looses the four angels bound in the great river Euphrates, which founded the Turkish Empire as we have seen, so the pouring out of this vial affects the same empire and brings it to ruin. Now likewise notice that Mr. Gill did not live past 1771, over a century before the beginning of this bowl judgment. But let's look at another commentator, Matthew Henry. He says, where it fell upon the great river Euphrates. Some, he says, take it literally for the place where the Turkish power and empire began. And they think this is a prophecy of the destruction of the Turkish monarchy and of idolatry, which they suppose will be affected about the same time with that of the papacy, as another Antichrist. Now, Mr. Henry lived a century and a half before this sixth bowl judgment. So now we see that we have three historicist Bible commentators who predicted, if you will, the interpretation of the sixth bowl judgment. And if this continuing view is correct, their predictions hit the mark. So this brings us to the official historicist interpretation of the sixth bowl, the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire. We obviously won't be able to depend upon the historical record from our previous commentators, but There are plenty of modern-day historicists who have been working hard on this interpretation, and we're going to begin with Christine Miller and her revelation of Jesus Christ revealed. The last time we saw the Euphrates River in Revelation, she says, it had been the boundary of Turkish power, which was restrained beyond the Euphrates until the proper time of its release during the sounding of the sixth trumpet. She says it's not a coincidence that we next encounter the Euphrates in the sixth bowl of wrath. God is a God of order. As the pouring out of the sixth bowl of wrath dries up the Euphrates, so that the obstacle for the kings of the East is removed, she says we will postulate that the obstacle in the way of the kings of the East was the Ottoman Turks, and the drying up of the Euphrates represents the drying up of the Ottoman power. After the Turks captured Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Roman Empire in 1453, they continued to grow in territory in the 15th and 16th centuries until they had conquered southern and eastern European states nearly to the gates of Vienna, Austria, or she says the southern borders of the Holy Roman Empire. Beginning in 1839, the Ottoman Empire began to enact reforms for its citizens, which the citizens of the Roman beast in the rest of Europe could only dream of. Full rights of citizenship were guaranteed to all, regardless of ethnicity or religion. Security of life and property was extended to all citizens, and universities, post offices, modern banking, separation of state and church, secularization of government, and many other modern advancements were likewise established. The empire established a constitutional monarchy in 1876, providing the force of law for these reforms. But after a few years, the Sultan revoked it for the same reasons that kings and nobles resisted constitutions in the rest of Europe in the 19th century. Then the Ottomans entered World War I on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. When the Central Powers lost the war in 1917, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved. The nation of Turkey was created from the ruins of the empire, with its capital of Istanbul, the former Constantinople. The map of the Middle East was redrawn, with Britain administering many of the newly created states, such as Palestine, in the former Ottoman territory. You know, if we could just watch a time-lapse movie showing all of the changes in empires and kingdoms throughout history, well, it would take a fairly long time, first off, but we would get a better sense of the similarity with which they rose and fell. And perhaps we could see that they're just really chess pieces on a board being moved about by the great hand of Yah. I mean, think about it. We saw the Roman Empire rise and fall, making way for the Holy Roman Empire, which left the Byzantine Empire, and that grew until it fell to the Ottoman Empire. Now, this should leave us asking, what empire or people groups does the fall of both the Ottoman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire make way for? And what does the partitioning of these former Ottoman lands between the French and the British have to do with the story of Rome, which is essentially the story of Revelation? Matthew Kendrick, in his article entitled How the Ottoman Collapse Led to Decades of Bloodshed in the Holy Land, segues into this subject and a clearer understanding of the history of this bowl judgment. He begins with an interesting question. Quick, when did the last Roman emperor abdicate power? Did you say 476 CE? Maybe 1453 for the fans of Byzantium. He says you'd be wrong, of course. The last emperor of Rome, or Kaiser i Rum as he would have put it, stepped down exactly 101 years ago today when Sultan Mehmed VI dissolved the Ottoman Empire. He says the Ottomans had claimed to be the successors to the Eastern Roman Empire, which they conquered in the 15th century. The Ottomans' end was a long time coming. Mehmet's ancestors struggled to reverse a long decline in Ottoman fortunes through the 18th and 19th centuries, and the nascent 20th had been no kinder. Revolts in the Balkans, driven by new ideas of ethno-nationalism, carved half a dozen new countries out of Ottoman lands in the years before World War I. But he says it was Istanbul's decision to side with Germany and Austria in that conflict that proved the coup de grace, as Istanbul's adversaries successfully exploited resentment against Turkish domination to weaken the empire's periphery. As the empire perished, the political, cultural, and economic structure that the Ottomans had imposed on the Middle East for nearly half a millennium unraveled with it, despite European attempts to reshape the region, leaving us, they say, to deal with the consequences even today. Wow, if that's true, if the repercussions of the Ottoman Empire falling is what gave us the basis for the Middle East we see around us today, then it seems fairly clear that the new empire or people group would be those kings from the East. And it also means those kings are already in place. We're not waiting for them to come. So the question is again, who are the kings of the East? Is it really China? Many think so. And even though you won't find the name of this large country in the scriptures, that doesn't mean it doesn't play a role. As we saw with America, it too is not named in the scriptures, but I believe it played a very important role in this history. In fact, both of these large countries played significant supporting roles in the book of Revelation. All of the trumpet judgments came from the East, people groups leaving what we know today as China. That's always been a very large empire early on. And America, as we saw during the second interval, turned out to be the great wilderness where God's people fled from the beast and was protected for a time, times, and half a time. So, if they aren't China, who are they? Well, before I unveil these kings according to the historicist view, I want to remind you of something I told you earlier on, even in our last video. Forget everything that you've ever heard about this part of the prophecy. And in our next slide, I believe Mr. Barnes sheds some light on these waters drying up for the kings from the East, even though it was all future to him. There is an allusion here undoubtedly to the dividing of the waters of the Red Sea so that the children of Israel might pass. In this description, the Euphrates is represented as a barrier to prevent the passage of the kings of the East on their way to the West for some purpose not yet specified. That is, applying the symbol of the Euphrates as being the seat of the Turkish power, the meaning is that that power is such a hindrance, and that in some way that hindrance is to be removed, as if the waters of an unbridged and unfordable river were dried up so as to afford a safe and easy passage through. Now, if we're looking for biblical precedent for people crossing over on dry ground, we have at least two: the Red Sea and the Jordan River. And next, Mr. Gill weighs in on who some of his contemporaries thought these kings were. Some understand of Christians in general, who are made kings and priests unto God, and of Christian kings in particular, whose way will be prepared by the declining state of Antichrist to express their hatred to the whore of Rome and to burn her flesh with fire. But he says the Romish Antichrist is not here intended. He says others think, as before observed, that the Jews are designed. Well, that the Jews will be converted in the last days seems manifest, he says, from Hosea chapter 3, verse 5, and other places. And that they will return to their own land is suggested in abundance of prophecies. He says it must be allowed that the Eastern as well as the Western Antichrist is a stumbling to them. I'm going to just do some speculating here, but I think Mr. Gill is referring to the Pope, of course, as the Western Antichrist, but could he be regarding Islam as the Eastern Antichrist? Do you remember that we alluded to the possibility of Catholicism having some connection to Islam, not only in its eruption upon the world, but in its shared tenets of faith? Now, I didn't cover that in depth, but I did give you a couple of links to research on your own. If you missed that video, you might want to go back to part 22b on the mark of the beast, in particular, the name and number of the beast. Possibly that is what is being referred to here. And since our last bowl pretty much removed the teeth of the papal beast, the only active arm, if you will, of this beast may be what we are seeing around us today. Mr. Gill continues. So that the destruction of the Turkish Empire will undoubtedly make way for their conversion and restoration to their own land. For the Turks being destroyed, the Mahometan religion will decline, the gospel will be carried into the eastern parts of the world, when they will become the kingdoms of our Lord, and the kings and princes of them will come to the brightness of Zion's rising. Matthew Henry is going to add a bit to this part. Remember, he's the third commentator we've seen today that died before the fulfillment of this, and so they're kind of looking forward-looking, predicting, if you will. He says the idolatry of the Church of Rome had been a great hindrance both to the conversion of the Jews and of the Gentiles. It is therefore very probable, says Mr. Henry, that the downfall of popery, removing these obstructions, will open a way for both the Jews and other Eastern nations to come into the Church of Christ. And, he says, if we suppose that Mohammedanism shall fall at the same time, there will be still a more open communication between the Western and Eastern nations, which may facilitate the conversion of the Jews and the fullness of the Gentiles. And when this work of God appears, and it is about to be accomplished, no wonder if it occasion another consequence, which is the last effort of that great dragon. Now remember, these three commentators, Albert Barnes, John Gill, and Matthew Henry, all died before the fulfillment of the sixth bowl judgment even began. But they all predicted the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and they were indeed correct. And now we see them all predicting that these kings from the East are believers, not pagans. Well, is there any way to prove this out? I think so. Stay with me and keep that mind open. So far, we've only covered speculation from our Bible commentators, but just a few real-life headlines will bear out the history that the waters of the Euphrates were indeed the Ottomans. At least that's the next great event in the annals of history. Now, this picture was reprinted in the Jerusalem Post on December the 9th, 2021, as that day marked the 104th anniversary of the day the Ottomans surrendered Jerusalem. The article reads, December 9 marks 104 years since the Ottoman surrender at the Battle of Jerusalem, winning major morale and strategic victory in a key city in this important World War I battle. The battle itself was a culmination of a long, bloody campaign in the Middle East by the British against the Turks. Throughout World War I, British forces suffered multiple humiliating and costly losses against the Turks. This included the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, the Battle of Kut in modern-day Iraq, and losses in Gaza. Taking the Holy City was important not just because of the religious symbolism for the largely Christian United Kingdom, but because it was vital for Ottoman supply routes and for the British to establish a stronger position. Fortune, however, began to change when, after a second loss at Gaza, the commanding general of what had been dubbed the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, General Sir Archibald Murray, was replaced with General Edmund Allenby, who had been given instruction by the Prime Minister to capture Jerusalem by Christmas. The battle for Jerusalem is thought to have begun on November the 17th, and it was not one simple clash for the city. Rather, it was a complex series of battles throughout the region, with fighting even happening as far as Jaffa. It saw decisive clashes as the outnumbered British forces were forced to contend with numerically superior Ottoman troops. But ultimately, the Ottomans couldn't win enough ground. The British held firm and stayed dug in by the city, and fresh troops from the rear were able to replace the tired ones entrenched in the front. It soon became apparent that the city was lost. The British army had almost completely encircled the city, and on December the 9th, the city's mayor, Hussein Salim al-Husseini, gave a letter of surrender. Now, this article goes on to report on a speech made by General Allenby to the people of Jerusalem, which I find very interesting, given the history going forward, even up until current day. He said, quote, "Furthermore, since your city is regarded with affection by the adherents of three of the great religions of mankind, and its soil has been consecrated both by the prayers and the pilgrimages of devout people of those three religions for many centuries, I hereby make it known to you that every sacred building, monument, holy spot, shrine, traditional site, endowment, pious bequest, or customary place of worship of whatever form of the three religions will be maintained and protected according to the existing customs and beliefs of those to whose faith they are sacred." Now, whether or not you would agree that he made the right decision there, the fact is that Israel today is very supportive of that same stance. Religious freedom is protected in Israel, regardless of your beliefs. Now, Christian, you and I both know that when Messiah returns, there will be only one faith, only one God, and only one people of God. At least that is according to the Holy Scriptures. And it will be something that he accomplishes at his return. So while even though the British took control of Jerusalem and eventually all Palestine after World War I, unfortunately, we see that only 2 decades later, World War II began. 20 years, though it may seem a lifetime to us, is only a blip on the radar screen to Yahweh. And though World War I, as we know, was dubbed the war to end all wars, it didn't live up to its name. If we tweak our perspective just a tad, we may see that these events aren't only related, but we may see them as a single event. And I'll explain why that might be important in just a moment. But first, khanacademy.org, in their article entitled 30 Years of Continuous War, helps us with our tweaking. They say the Great War was fought from 1914 to 1919. But when another major conflict happened from 1939 to 1945, the two events became known as the First World War and the Second World War. As with book titles, this sounds less like separate wars and more like two parts of the same story. Indeed, they say, many historians argue it was all one long continuous war. Are they right? They say one way to find out if two events are continuous is to look for continuities, the themes and situations that connect them. This article is fairly lengthy, but it makes the case that there were apparent continuities between these two conflicts, and they define them as nationalism, empire, and colonialism. They conclude with the fact that the continuities do suggest that the unsatisfying conclusion of the first conflict probably contributed to the second. And I think most historians agree that they are linked. As always, you can find the link to that entire article in the description area below this video. And so, when the German War, or the Second World War, concluded in 1945, the world issued a huge sigh of relief, albeit for just a moment. And so now I'm going to make my case for why link these two world wars as a single event. And simply ask, how does that change things? Well, first off, it would change the dates for this bold judgment, for one, and it would answer a conundrum that I've had for several years regarding this portion of the prophecy. As I have continued to study this view of Revelation for a couple decades now, I've pondered where several key historical elements were located in the book, such as I don't know, the Holocaust. Surely an event that, of that magnitude should have been relevant enough to mention. Or again, what about World War II? I mean, I believed for some time that the Sixth Bowl was the defeat of the Ottoman Empire via World War I, but I didn't see another huge event that matched the Second World War. I even went so far as to contact the author of the Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed, Mrs. Miller, to ask her thoughts on the matter, but unfortunately never got a response. So I was content to leave it until the Lord, if he so chose, would clarify this inconsistency for me. And if you've been with me long enough, I hope you already know that I'm not one to say, "Thus saith the Lord," except when quoting the Holy Scriptures themselves. But in preparing for this video, I believe I may have gotten my answer. And in this, I'm going to stray from Christine Miller's stated dates for the Sixth Bowl judgment and say that its fulfillment began in 1876 and concluded in 1945. Because I believe we need to focus on events that happened just after the Second World War, shortly after 1945. But we're going to have to talk about the kings from the East first. And Wikipedia.org has an article entitled Mandatory Palestine, in which they tell us the 1948 Palestine War ended with the territory of Mandatory Palestine divided among the State of Israel, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which annexed territory on the west bank of the Jordan River, and the Kingdom of Egypt, which established the All-Palestine Protectorate in the Gaza Strip. Now, I'm going to give you two possible solutions, as I said before, to this conundrum of mine, and I'll let you know which one is my favorite. But it could be said that this single event, what we usually call World War I and World War II, did indeed prepare the way for kings from the East. We could look at Israel, this Kingdom of Jordan, and even the Kingdom of Egypt. In other words, this single event of the Sixth Bowl broke up and reestablished new lines of demarcation, new kingdoms, if you will, which would play out in the end of days, that is, in the very last bowl judgment. And that's a historical fact that can't be denied. However, there's a very much more rich and interesting take that I believe to be more fitting for this author and this book and his climactic ending. Scripture is replete with similar phrasing. Let's take Isaiah 40, verse 3 for an example. The voice of him that cries in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of Yahweh, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. So we see this prepare ye the way in Scripture. These are the same Greek words used in the book of Revelation for Bowl 6 when we look at the Septuagint, that Greek version of Isaiah. But let's look at Matthew 24. For as the lightning comes out of the east and shines even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Is Matthew telling us that Messiah will come from the east? Well, can you prove that? That might be stretching it, but let's look at Ezekiel chapter 43. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east, and his voice was like a noise of many waters, and the earth shined with his glory. So we do have precedent for the Lord coming from the east. And let's look at Revelation chapter 1, verse 6, where we were told that we have been made kings and priests unto God and to his Father. So, it's just a reminder that the book of Revelation, in its first chapter, tells us that we're kings. I hope the picture that is coming to mind is that these kings from the East could be the good guys and not the bad guys as we have been trained to think. The Jamieson Fawcett Brown commentary, written in 1871, saw it that way. He shall come from the East, but not alone, for his elect, transfigured saints of Israel and the Gentiles shall accompany him, who are kings and priests unto God. So again, we see the idea of these kings being us. They continue. As the anti-Christian 10 kings accompany the beast, so the saints accompany as kings the King of Kings to the last decisive conflict. I hope by now you recognize this photo in the background as the Valley of Megiddo, the place of the final Battle of Armageddon, where the kings of the earth will face off against the King of Kings and his kings from the east. Now, not only did the early Bible commentators view these kings as the good guys, but as I said a moment ago, I really feel everything has fallen into place for the timing to be correct to prove this out. I mean, the very next event in the book of Revelation is the third interval, which we now know to be spiritual events. And some time ago, I disclosed that this third interval was a time when the body of believers were splintered even further. And that, of course, is going to be the topic of our next video. But the very next event after that is the pouring out of the final bowl judgment, the seventh bowl, where there's going to be the largest earthquake ever, an unbelievably large hailstorm, and the arrival of Messiah for the Battle of Armageddon. So, you see, I believe there is no time left for any other characters to take center stage. The players who are in that arena now have the only parts left to act out. Indeed, I believe that what we're seeing around us today, the conflict in the Middle East ramping up though it seems to be, these are just the final events before Messiah returns. Now, of course, only time is going to prove me right or wrong, but just read the book. This is the end of the play. We are in the final act. The rest, well, it's just a description of the curtain falling on our enemies. So now, let's zero in on that history right after the end of World War II to see if we can prove out this hypothesis. The Palestine Post proudly printing, "The State of Israel is born," with the United States recognizing the Jewish state immediately. Folks, this is nothing less than prophecy fulfilled. And you would think that everyone knows this historical fact, but sadly, if you were to ask the average man or woman on the street today, you would probably find otherwise. So let's take a quick look at some of those prophecies, just in case we need convincing. Clarence Larkin, in his commentary on Revelation, looks at how Israel is compared to trees in Scripture. And now, although he compares Israel to several different trees, we're going to focus here on the fig tree that we recognize from Matthew chapter 24. Mr. Larkin overlays this parable upon history. He says, in the parable of the barren fig tree, we have another picture of Israel. The fig tree is the Jewish nation. It was planted in a vineyard, which we have seen stands for the land of Palestine. The owner of the vineyard and of the fig tree was God. He came in the person of his son Jesus, and for 3 years of Jesus' ministry, he had sought for fruit from the Jewish nation and found none. He therefore decided to cut down the tree, that is, to remove the nation from the vineyard. But the tree was not destroyed immediately, for intercession was made for it, and he says the day of grace was lengthened out for 40 years. And then the axeman Titus, at the head of the Roman army, besieged Jerusalem in AD 70, and Israel, the fig tree, was cut down and cast out of the vineyard into the field of the world. And we will remember that after that siege of Jerusalem, that's when the diaspora became permanent. But while the fig tree, Israel, was cut down and cast out of the vineyard, Palestine, its root was not destroyed. The axe was only laid at the root of the tree. The root itself was not killed or removed from the soil. He says it is clear then from the parable of the fig tree that a new tree will spring from the root. That is, the nation of Israel will revive. And when it shall reach the point where it shall put forth leaves, then we shall have the fig tree sign that Christ's return is not far away. In this case, the fig tree will bear leaves before it bears fruit, says Mr. Larkin, for Israel is to be revived nationally before she is converted. Clarence Larkin's commentary on Revelation was published in 1919. So this was his take before World War II, and consequently before Israel became a nation again. Now, his comment that Israel, the fig tree, would produce leaves before its fruit is simply breathtaking. Israel came back into the land before producing fruit. In other words, the dry bones came together before the flesh and sinew appeared. That's exactly where we are, folks. In fact, I believe we're seeing the fruit ripen today and the flesh and the sinew appear, because there are many messianic ministries in Israel, such as One for Israel and the Tree of Life Israel, who are preaching the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ, of Messiah Yeshua. And Judah is beginning to open his eyes and ears and turn to his Jewish Messiah as never before. And isn't that why Yahweh is bringing things to a head right now? To bring about the complete restoration of his people? These are indeed exciting times that we live in. To be the generation who could very well see these things come to pass. Be sure to check out the links below to these ministries, and particularly the link about Isaiah chapter 53, the forbidden chapter. It's going to renew your faith in God and in this book and in this historicist view. Let's quickly summarize now the sixth bowl of wrath. We saw the Euphrates power, the Ottoman Turks, enter World War I on the side of the Central Powers, and when those Central Powers lost the war, the map of the Middle East was redrawn, with Britain and France administering the newly created states. It took World War II to open the way for Israel to become a nation again, hence putting all of the players in place for Armageddon. Beautifully orchestrated by the great maestro, World War I is what dried up the Euphrates River, and World War II prepared the way for the kings from the east, again putting Israel back on the map, redrawing the lines of those kingdoms around her that will face off in the very near future. And so we see this tweaking of our perspective about the sixth bowl judgment really does change everything. With World War I ending in 1917, the first half of the prophecy was fulfilled. And the second half of the prophecy was fulfilled by the second half of that war, preparing the way for Israel to become a nation again in 1948 and for those kingdoms around her to form. Well, it's just been over 3/4 of a century since that sixth bowl fulfillment until today. And that brings us to the topic for our next video, where we're going to look at that last century and find the third and final interval of the book of Revelation between the sixth and seventh bowl judgments. And if you remember in an earlier video, I gave you a sneak preview of this interval, divulging that it's where Yahweh gathers the kings of the earth that have been yet again duped by the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. He gathers them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. But have no fear before they can do their worst. Yeshua seems to be telling us that he's going to return before that happens. Won't you join me next time to discover the schemes that those three demonic frogs planned and what sorcery the enemy of our soul conjured up before his demise? I hope you can join me next time on the Book of Revelation, Historicist View, for Part 27, Meet Me on the Battlefield. But until then, stay well. Keep reading, studying, and sharing this Book of Revelation. And as always, Shalom.